Ohio. Stuart Des. I hope I got that right. Before I lapse into some very bad English jokes, I will thank the organising committee for the very kind invitation to be here this morning, back in Tokyo for my third visit, to which somebody says they obviously didn't understand you the previous time. That was the first bad joke. And very much welcome you all to this session. And can I say I apologise that I'm the first speaker after that wonderful display, so everything else is downhill from there. I'm also slightly worried because the person with the sword was definitely pointing it at me. Okay, time is short, so I'm going to move on to my presentation. And I want to say that I'm English. I'm English, but I'm from work in Australia. So first of all, congratulations to Japan for a wonderful Rugby World Cup, and congratulations also to South Africa on beating my country in the final. Absolutely 100% fair and square. They were the best side. Now, as you know, Australia is a very large country, and I live down there in Brisbane, in the southern part of Queensland. That's where Japan would fit into Australia. So, although it goes top to bottom, there's a lot of land either side. And there's a road sign near my house that says Cairns is about 1,700 kilometres away. And no, it's not the other side of Australia, it's doing that journey. So, it's a long, long way. I'm going to speak about 4 themes in this presentation, and I'll be fairly brief on each. I'll say a little bit about tradition, particularly around what we mean by sport and sport for all. But I want to move quickly onto the innovation side and talk about what we call movement guidelines, 24-hour guidelines, moving beyond health. And that last poll was extremely interesting. I'll try and come back to that. And I want to also talk about behaviour change. My background is in physical activity and in psychology and in behaviour change. So the first one is a slightly boring topic, as my friend here illustrates. It's about definitions and it's about purpose of what we might call sport. Now, I came across this interesting quote. I hope some of you recognise it. I will read it so we're all familiar with it. Sport, physical activity, elite and grassroots sports, play, movement, traditional sports and games, leisure, recreational sports, whatever you wish to call it. Sport for all has the power to make a change, to make the world a better place. So my first point is, look at all the terms that we have in there that reflect what we do. And of course this is TAFISA's mission for 2030. So it's what's been written for this organisation. And I found it very interesting that they use the phrase, whatever you wish to call it. Because, for me, actually, sport is a small part of physical activity. Exercise is also a part of physical activity, but movement is physical activity. But I'm also aware that for many of you in this room, you use the word sport in a much more general and a much more, all-encompassing way than perhaps I would and some other cultures would. So I'm not saying who's right and who's wrong, I'm just saying we need to be aware, because if we want to promote physical movement, we need to get the words right for the people outside who we're trying to get a message towards. I think in Australia and in the UK, if you promoted only sport, you would be restricting the opportunities. Other countries, sport means all physical activity. So traditionally, we've used the term sport for all. I'm just throwing out some possibilities that we might want to think beyond just the word sport. For example, if you go to traditional purposes of sport and physical activity, you can come across things like health, of course. You go back many decades where the health of young populations was a concern for politicians. You've got education through schools. You've got fitness for the military. There were a number of purposes that were served by physical activity, including sport. And even my old American university, I did my master's degree at Pennsylvania State University, and I graduated 40 years ago, this month. 40 years, yeah. I know what you're saying. I know what you're saying. He can't be that old. But it was 40 years ago. That's their American football stadium. And it now seats 110,000 people. So what's their purpose of sport? Is it money? Is it publicity? Is it something else? It can be very wide-ranging. And so my last point on tradition is that we have traditionally promoted physical activity for fitness. And fitness was a big factor for you on that poll, which was good. But this is the American College of Sports Medicine recommendation that was one of the first to be published, at least internationally in the English language, in 1978. That was the 41 years ago when I started at Penn State University. And it's all about developing and maintaining fitness. It's not about promoting physical activity. It's not about sport for all in one sense. It's about getting fit. And so the guidelines tell you how to get fit. And that's quite different from the messages that we're giving now, which I'll move on to. So I want to talk about more contemporary ways that we think about physical activity. So let's take the first one on movement guidelines and what we call 24-hour guidelines. So movement guidelines would be typical physical activity guidelines that governments produce and the World Health Organization produce. We're working on a revised WHO set of guidelines right now. I'm part of one of those groups. So one way to look at this is to look at a 24-hour period. And during the 24-hour period, if we could be sleeping, of course, and then during waking hours, we have to be doing one of these three behaviors. We are either sitting or sedentary. We are doing light physical activity, which is what I'm doing now. I'm on my feet, I'm not sitting, I'm moving, but in a very light intensity way. Or we could become more vigorous and more intense in our physical activity and do moderate to vigorous physical activity. That one might be some sports, games, fitness activities and so on. Now in any one moment we have to do one of those. You're currently sedentary, in a few minutes you'll be light intensity physical activity, later in the day you might be doing moderate to vigorous, and then tonight you'll sleep. And you cannot really do two of those behaviours at the same time. Even if you're sitting down and exercising, you're not sitting in the sedentary sense. You are being physically active. So that's quite important to recognise because it means we need to be switching between these behaviours and perhaps switching more often than we often do. So at the end of this talk, I recommend that when you give me some applause, you stand up to do it. All right, okay, maybe not. Only if it's good. So if you look at the 24-hour day here, look how much of it is moderate to vigorous physical activity. It's usually about 2% of our day. It's a very, very small part. Now you could focus all of your behaviour change efforts on that, and that would be fine, but you would have to do a lot of work to increase that percentage. But you could do a lot to reduce your sedentary time, you could do a lot to to increase your light physical activity, and of course we still need to keep our good quality sleep. So behaviours move between those sectors of that diagram, and that's an important point to take away. Now you look at guidelines. I'm not expecting you to read this detail. This is from the Netherlands, their recent guidelines, look how much it's moved on from the American guidelines in 1978 that says get fit by doing 3 times a week of fitness activities. This is saying things like we need to do moderate, we need to do light, we need to sit less, we need to do muscle strengthening, we need to do bone health activities. It tells you that the greatest gains are from moving from doing nothing to doing something, rather than getting already active people to do a bit more. Of course that's fine, but it's not where the greatest gains are. It's become much more sophisticated in what we understand about physical activity for health. And so you have this 24-hour guideline where we give recommendations for sleep, for physical activity, and for inactivity or sitting, like recreational screen time. And it's a combination of all of those that leads to healthy lifestyle, at least as far as activity is concerned. And so the trends that we can look at in terms of innovation, we have the so-called rise of the sitting, studies of sitting, sedentary behaviour. We have a rise of interest in research and practice around light intensity physical activity. It's recognised as more important than we used to think. And we've moved beyond just fitness activities. It's much more than that, as your poll suggested. So if you look at all of these activities that you might want to promote, you could have things, obviously we've got physical education, we've got sport, we've got fitness activities, but we've got others, martial arts, dance, holistic movement like yoga and Tai Chi. The list could go on, and they all serve different purposes, they all have different effects, and they all have different preferences from individuals. Okay, my third theme is that it's not just about health. Health is really, really important as a justification for why we want to promote sport for all and physical activity. But in my opinion, it is not the sole reason we become active ourselves. So if you want to change people, you need to go beyond health. So here's a way that I like to look at it. We have a misalignment, we're out of balance when it comes to the rationale for health against what individual people want out of physical activity. So the first point to make is that the doctor and the researcher will tell you you should be physically active because it's good for you. It's healthy. And that's the rationale we have for physical activity guidelines. But if you ask an individual what they want to get out of their physical activity, and actually this is illustrated in that poll you've just completed, it's not about physical health as the number one reason. It's about enjoyment and purposeful physical activity, being with other people, having enjoyment, having fun. Actually, having fun can be dissected in lots of different ways, but it illustrates the point. So what they want, and what they say they want, is usually different from what the policy and what the politicians and what the guidelines tell us is the reason to be physically active. So I actually think we've got it wrong to be expecting everybody to be physically active for health as their number one priority. I think we need to have a different message. So if you go back to the 1980s, there was a very famous article in the areas that I study called The Determinants of Physical Activity and Exercise. And there's a conclusion there that says no evidence supports the idea that increased knowledge about exercise leads to enhanced participation. So just telling people it's good for them is not enough. And they follow that up by saying that feelings related to well-being and enjoyment are more important for maintaining activity than concerns about health. Health might get you started, but it's not enough to make you continue. And I think this is an important message we need to take away with us. And there was a more recent survey that said that the top benefits people desired from being physically active were about personal energy and happiness, not staving off diabetes or reducing obesity. Energy and happiness. It's a very much more personalised message. So very quickly on to theme 4. we talk about behaviour change, and there's this behaviour change wheel. It's just one framework we could look at, where you look at capability, opportunity and motivation, and you look at the ways that we can produce that change. So this so-called Combi model, capability, where we look at people's physical and psychological capability to do physical activity and modify it accordingly. We look at the opportunities that people have to be physically active, and we look at their motivation. And I want to talk in this last section on motivation. So, motivation can be automatic or it can be reflective. This is important. There are at least these two types of motivation. So the first one we call the type 1 route. It's an automatic form of motivation, relatively automatic. And it's known to be a fast way of processing through your brain. Information and actions are processed fast because it's driven by positive feelings, by a supportive environment, by having a habit so you don't really think about it. It has low conscious processing. Okay? So I'll give you the example I always give in this situation. When you came into this room today, why did you sit down? Well, I'll tell you why you sat down. Because it's automatic. You think it'll be fine to sit down for the next hour and a half for the opening session. It's a habit. In fact, you know what? I didn't even think about it. I didn't think about it. It's automatic. And it's expected of us in this situation. So why would we expect anything different? That's fine. And here are some examples. You could have, you could change people's recycling and garbage bins that are provided. I'm not sure what you have in Tokyo, but certainly back in Australia, those blue and green bins are fairly familiar for each household. Now, if you make one bigger than the other, that might make a difference as to which one you use. You don't think about it, you just do it. Or maybe you collect one every week and another one every 2 weeks. That makes a difference. And the one above is where you have smiley faces on the healthy food and you have not smiley faces on the unhealthy food. Just simple things like that. It doesn't tell you what to do, but it prompts you to do it in a very low-key way. So that's the fast route. What about the more reflective route? This is slow. It's thinking. It's reflecting. It's planning what I'm going to do with my physical activity. It involves a lot of brain power. This is the typical way that we ask people to become physically active. We say, let's have a, I think I've got something here, yeah, let's have a plan. Let's write it down in your diary. Let's think about what you're going to do on Monday afternoon, Tuesday morning, when are you going swimming, what time, where are you going, who are you going with. That's all fine, it can work, it does work, but it requires a lot of effort. And for a lot of people, too much effort. So we have to combine these two motivational processes. We have to have some thinking, of course we do, but we also have to make it easy for people to get involved in these activities. So we have to create better environments and make it easier. And this is reflected here. So you have a choice of going from low motivation to high motivation, or from something that's hard to do to easy to do. And you have to choose which one of these do you think would be the best way to get somebody physically active. Shall I make it easier for them to do it? For example, not have the lifts or the elevators very accessible, and make the stairs more accessible. Mind you, climbing to my room on the 17th floor might be a challenge. But you should make things easy for people to do, or do we just get them more motivated, create more motivation, however you do that? Well, I think we generally think that creating the high motivation is difficult to do and sustain. We need some of it, but it's quite difficult. The good solution is that we can make things easier for people to do by changing environments and making a more automatic form of motivation. And there's the answer. That is the solution to obesity. But, in case you think I'm completely crazy, I'm going to finish in 1 minute, you can overlay the important influences, such as individual physical activity environments. These are the things that we think can make physical activity easier to do. So my joke about this being the solution is not quite so silly, because we have these big influential factors that are very important for us to understand. Okay, let me conclude very quickly. I think we should emphasize physical activity and sport for all behaviors for many people and make small changes across large populations. We need to create positive and accessible environments, and I hope that's consistent with the Active Cities theme. And we need to make behaviors easier to do rather than expect more motivation. Thank you very much for your time.